Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to the Managrind tournament recap, talking about the top decks, talking about the top cards, and state of the metagame for this week's tournament. So, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? On to the top four from NA, we had in first place MG Reels, in second place MG Spo, and tied for third we had Scarface and QK is my name. Now, on to Reels, who as usual was playing a rogue deck. It's his most successful class, the one we've seen the most out of him, and this time he brought a Miracle Rogue build. Now Miracle Rogue is a deck that's very focused around spells as opposed to actual minions, so we'll start with the spells in this case. So, onto the actual spells, we have Preparation, because a lot of when it comes down to it with Miracle Rogue, you really want to make as much use of your mana as possible. You want to be able to use maybe 4 or 5 mana maximum when casting a huge train of spells, and Preparation really helps with this. It's also a free spell in the first place, so it helps out with things like Gadget Sand. Anyway, we also have one of Blade Flurry to go with the one of Assassin's Blade and also the Deadly Poisons as a board wipe, 2 Cold Bloods for burst damage, a Conceal to protect your Gadget Sand Auctioneers and other sort of win conditions like Leroy, 2 Eviscerates for burst damage and also just standard removal. Shadow Step really helps with the Leroy combo and can also set up your own Gadget Sand, so you can play it, draw a couple cards, Shadow Step it. Next turn play it, draw a couple of cards. Good combo starter. Then we have 2 Phantom Knives to help with board wipe. Although it's not as potent in this deck because we don't have things like spell damage to use, but it's still useful. Then we have the Shivs for cantripping, setting up your hand perfectly, actually building your hand if you have a Gadget Sand. Backstabs, they're free spells, pretty good removal. Deadly Poisons, I said, to buff up the Assassin's Blade and also your standard dagger for things like Blade Flurry, and the Saps to deal with those annoying taunts that you just don't want to deal with. Now, the weapon Assassin's Blade, it's very good at pumping up for Blade Flurry, but if you put Deadly Poison on this thing, you end up with a 5/4 weapon. 20 damage on a weapon is a huge deal and should not be underestimated. But anyway, on to the actual minions. We have the standard Blood Mage Thalnos, as you'd expect from this kind of deck. One of spell damage minion, useful. Edwin Van Cleef can become an 8/8, 10/10, 12/12 in this kind of deck with all the free spells you can pump out, and it's a very powerful win condition. Leroy Jenkins synergizes very well with Shadow Step and Cold Blood, deal huge amounts of burst out of nowhere. Nat Pagle helps sculpt your hand, along with Gadget Sand Auctioneer, who's your late game draw engine. SI7 is just amazing, especially if you have all the combo starters like Preparation, Backstabs, Shivs, even things like Shadow Step, things like that. And then we have one of Acolyte Pain, which is very interesting, but if you think about it, you can shiv your own Acolyte, and if you have a Gadget Sand on the board, you draw 3 cards, which is incredible. 2 mana, you damage your own Acolyte, draw a card, then Shiv goes off, draw a card, and then it triggers Gadget Sand, draw a card. You just draw 3 cards out of 2 mana. It's incredible. You can also do this with Backstab to draw 2 cards from 0. It's a very powerful tech. Very interesting. It's kind of like a third copy of Gadget Sand almost. A very interesting one to include. Anyway, on to Spo's deck, who as usual was playing a Druid deck. Another person who's really known for a certain class. He brought a Druid Watchers variant. Now, as usual with Druid decks, if there's multiple versions of the same thing, I'm just going to sort of go over the different tech cards. But because this is the first one, we'll go over it fully. Now, Druid Watchers is a variant of Druid Beatdown. It came from Dark Onyxes originally, whereas the Beatdown deck came from Strife Crow. Sort of a little bit of the derivatives for some of these. But anyway, Druid Watchers, as I said, is a derivative of Druid Beatdown, which includes Watchers along with ways of turning them on, like Sunfury Protectors and Defender of Argus. This one's playing the full 2 Ancient Watchers. But anyway, on for the actual rest of the minions. We have standard Blood Mage Thalnos and Cairn. Cenarius is the 9-drop that they're playing in this case instead of something like Ysera or Ragnaros. Ragnaros being an 8-drop, but similar role. And we have standard Nat Pagle to set up your early game. Black Knight Tinkmaster, as Druid doesn't have hard removal and needs to get over those big threats. Ancient Allure to really power you through in the mid to late game. Ancient Watchers provide basically chill Wind Yetis at the beginning of the game, and you can silence them or you can buff them up with taunt and just do disgusting things with them. One of Azure Drake is a very good draw engine, sometimes provides spell damage for your swipes and wraths and things like that. Defender of Argus is good in general, but also helps a lot with the Ancient Watchers. Keeper of the Grove is one of the best silence minions in the game, do not underestimate it. Sunfury Protector, again, enables your Ancient Watchers. Then we have the Druid of the Claws, standard minions. Harvest Golem and Chill Wind Yeti are sort of the basics from this deck, and they do very well, show up in a lot of different decks, especially Chill Wind Yeti has been coming up a lot recently, because it just doesn't die too much. Chill Wind Yeti is one of those cards that doesn't die to any of the shadow words, which is relevant because some priests showed up here. it doesn't really die to most removal apart from Lava Burst. It has to be hard removed or just continuously beaten down. So it's a very, very powerful minion, should not be underestimated. I would definitely test it. As to the actual spells, not much to talk about. Double Wrath, Swipe, Innervate, Force of Nature, Savage Roll. Pretty standard. What I expect out of Spo. He's a very, very good player. He tends to sort of refine his strategies as opposed to trying out new stuff, and it works. Anyway, on to Scarface, who's playing a rogue mid-range deck. Completely different style of deck from what came first in the Miracle. In this case, we have a rogue mid-range deck, not cantrip. This is actually mid-range. We have things like Karen Bloodhoof for the mid-game, along with Nat Pagel to set up your early game. We have Leroy Jenkins for burst. Ragnaros for late game, an interesting one in rogue decks. Black Knight Tinkmaster to help because you don't playing Assassinates in this version. Then we have Argent Commander to deal with things like Azure Drake and help finish things off later on. Speaking of Azure Drake, he's also playing his own. It works very, very well with things like Backstab. It's one of the best combinations you can run out on turn 5. It's killing something Backstab after playing your Azure Drake, even unless you set up some other things you may draw into it, things like that. It's an interesting combo. Then we have Defender of Vargas to help a lot against these sort of Hunter decks that are just trying to rush you down. Same with Warrior to some extent. It's just a very powerful card in general. SI7 for its utility. Argent Squire is an interesting one, but if you think about it, on turn 2 you can run it out with a Cold Blood, and then you have a 4-1 with Divine Shield. It's very difficult to deal with. Not amazing against certain sort of classes like Druid and Mage, but keep in mind this is a tournament with sideboarding, so you can always side them out against classes that is really, really bad against. So it's a good 1-drop to have around. Then we have standard Harvest Golem and Chillwind Yeti for good efficient trading early, and 2 Loot Hoarders, a cantrip minion we haven't seen in ages. Basically you just play it down, it dies, sets up your next turns. It's kind of like a mini Blood Mage Thalnos, which is an interesting note, is not in this deck. Very, very interesting to see it's not in this deck. Probably attributed to collection as opposed to anything else. Some people don't have Blood Mage, but it's definitely something to look into for this kind of deck. But in this case, we are seeing the double Loot Hoarder for setting up your later turns. As for the actual spells, we've got 2 Cold Bloods, I already mentioned, with Eviscerates for burst damage. We've got the Backstabs, Synergy with Azure Drake, and just free removal. Everyone loves free removal. Then we have Deadly Poison synergized with your Perdition's Blade, and also with your Hero Power, and a 1-of Blade Flurry, again synergized with Perdition's Blade and also the Deadly Poison. Speaking of Perdition's Blade, very, very powerful weapon, very good at sort of multiple removal. You can sometimes kill 3 different things with this. Mostly it will kill 2 things overall, but sometimes it will kill 3. It can also deal 6 straight damage. Very, very good weapon. Now, on to QK is my name, who are playing sort of the obligatory Warrior Legendaries deck. Now, this is an interesting one. Warrior Legendaries has a habit of showing up in almost every single top 4 of some kind. It always shows up in one of them. Never enough to sort of do really, really well in women, but it always shows up. It's an interesting deck. But anyway, so Warrior Legendaries has gone through many iterations in the past. Current version, which is what people tend to be running, is running early Enrage minions with late game win conditions. As for the actual Enrage engine in this case, we have the standard Armor Smith along with Frothing Berserker for a punch early, and Acolyte Pain to set up your later turns. Cruel Taskmaster enables these, and you can get some seriously powerful Acolyte Pains, for example. 3-2, trade, draw 2 cards. Very good combination. Harvest Golem Chillwind Yeti showing up here as well for the efficient trading early. Faceless Manipulator is not dead in this deck. You can copy their stuff, you can copy any of your stuff. So many conditions in this deck that you can just copy a bunch of different things. Then for the spells, we've got Standard Control and Brawl, Shield Block, Shield Slam to do massive amounts of damage straight off for very little amount of mana. Whirlwind synergizes with your own engine, and then we have the Execute because it's the only thing they have that's close to hard removal. And then we have Fiery War Axe as weapons, which helps deal with some 2-drops, 3-drops, sometimes even direct damage. Although it is, in this kind of deck, you're more likely to go for removal with it as opposed to direct damage because you're not playing full out aggro. The only real punch you have early game is in Frothing Berserker. You don't really have it from anything else. But anyway, onto the win conditions of the deck. We have Karen Bloodhoof. Not usually a win condition, but you can copy him with Faceless Manipulator, and sometimes you just can't deal with him considering you have to deal with all the other stuff. Then we have Ragnaros, Ysera, Alexstrasza, Grom, all end the game very, very quickly if not dealt with, and you have to deal with all 4. Not an easy feat. Then we have Tinkmaster to sort of clear the way out, and a Nat Pagel to set up for your later turns. So, On to the top 4 from EU. We had in first place another Managrind team member, Timbolt. Second place, Fabix. And then tied for third, we had Shark and Tish. So, Timbolt brought a priest deck. Yes, it's a priest watcher deck. Now, this is what happens when you remove the warlock from Warlock Giants. I'm gonna be quite frank, this is exactly what happens. Anyway, so this particular deck is playing the Nat Pagel to set up your later turns early and often. Cabal Shadow Priest can steal things like Harvest Golem usually, or even Nat Pagel. Not usually Nat Pagel that late in the game, but it does happen from time to time. But mostly Harvest Golem is the target for this thing. Then we have Spellbreaker is a good silence to have around. 2 Northshire Clerics set up your late game, along with the Nat Pagels. 3 different draw minions, very, very powerful. And then for the actual spells, we have 2 Holy Fires for direct damage. Thought Steal is an extra draw engine. Holy Nova for AoE. Mind Control helps a lot with these late game decks. Shadow Word Death deals with a lot of different threats like Ancient Allure, Sylvanas, Ragnaros, Alexstrasza, all the big stuff. It doesn't deal with Cairn, unfortunately, and it doesn't deal with things like Argent Commander and Azure Drake. That's the one problem with the Shadow Word removal. The other side of it, Shadow Word Pain deals with things like Harvest Golem and Sunfear Protector, Defender of Argus, deals with a lot of different things you just don't want to deal with early game. And then lastly for spells we have Powerwood Shield, which is usually going to be targeted on either one of your big sort of win conditions or on a Northshire Cleric to buff it up, so it's kind of difficult to remove. Now you notice I'm avoiding part of the deck list there. Now the reason I'm avoiding this is because that is the full Shields Up engine. The whole thing. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, the Shields Up engine is a engine of Defender of Argus and Sunfury Protector along with all of its most powerful targets. That is the Shields Up engine. It revolves around literally putting up shields to defend yourself from pretty much anything and then smashing them into the ground. So, first thing from the Shields Up engine, Defender of Argus, Sunfury Protector. Enable all of your taunts. Defender of Argus more powerful, more expensive, good to run both. Then, going up the chain, we have Ancient Watcher. Yes, Ancient Watcher is the weakest Shields Up minion. Comes down early, really, really cheap at 2 mana. You can just throw them out easily. Purely defensive in this deck. You can silence it with 1 Spellbreaker, but it's kind of awkward just having 1 silence for it. But it can come up at times. But most of the time you just put this down, give it taunt, they can't attack you, get to set up your mid game. What is your mid game? Twilight Drake. Twilight Drake can be a 4/9, 4/8 usually in this kind of deck. You don't have life taps, so usually probably about 4/7. But if you give it a buff with Defender of Argus, you end up with a 5/8 with taunt. That is essentially an Ancient of War on turn 5. Incredibly powerful one to use. Twilight Drake is one of those cards which is very, very underestimated, but should not be because there isn't that much silence in the metagame currently. There is from time to time, but not that much, so it is usually just a 4x, which will deal a lot of damage, and will just trade with lots and lots of minions, and is a very, very powerful value minion. Now, where's the actual punch coming from the Shields Up engine would be the 4 giants. 2 Mountain Giants, sort of the counterpart to Twilight Drake, where it's more powerful, but also is harder to cast because you need to have a lot of cards even just to play it. It's not just more powerful the more cards you have. But having an 8/8 on turn 5 usually, or turn 6, very, very powerful. Come down, give it taunt, your opponent can't do much. Molten Giant's the other half of this equation, being the I'm really, really low, I need to end the game now button. Basically, you get down to 10 life, you then drop double Moltens, give them buffs with Defender of Argus, and then heal yourself up because you're a priest, and then suddenly you're winning. Molten Giant is a very, very powerful comeback card, one of the strongest in the game, and is one of those things that just shouldn't be underestimated, even though it is. There's usually only 1 big game hunter in some decks, or none nowadays. They have been dropping them recently, although sometimes there's the 1, but not usually more than 1, so you can make these giants stick, and they're very, very difficult to remove. Now, second, we had FABBX, playing Druid Token mid-range. Now, I think, wait a second, Jotto, what kind of title is that? Yeah, you'll see what I mean when we get into this. So we have the standard thing with Blood Mage Thanos and Leroy, give you some aggro and also some setup, with also that Pagel being the setup. And then we have Ancient Allure for the mid to late game, sort of keeping your hand up and also healing yourself against things like Hunters. Then we have Azure Drake, same Same thing, cantrips, keeps your hand size to a fairly large degree. Keeper of the Grove, one of the best silencers in the game. Now, besides Druid of the Claw, we have an interesting little phase here. We have Ardent Squire for early game pressure, along with some of the buffs in the actual deck. Then we have Harvest Golem, which can leave a token behind. You see where this is going. Loot Hoarder, when he dies, he draws a card, so you can invest into him. And then we have Violet Teacher. Now, the Violet Teacher is sort of where the token thing comes from this. But I didn't really want to call it full tokens because it's not playing that many token cards apart from that. But the reason I called tokens in the first place is because it's also playing the double Power of the World. And the interaction between those two is you play Power of the World as the buff. Violet Teacher makes a token, then that token and the teacher get buffed. So you end up making a 2-2. It's a very, very solid interaction. Power of the World also buffs the Argent Squire, which is why the Argent Squire is the one drop of choice. It also works quite well with Harvest Golem tokens and also Loot Hoarder. Anyway, besides that though, with the spells, we do have Wrath, Swipe, Innervate, Force of Nature, Savage Roar with the second copy of Savage Roar, which was the standard set by Noxious from last week, which allows you just to use Savage Roar more often. Normally you want to use Savage Roar with Force of Nature, but because you can make tokens from Violet Teacher, the Savage Roar is live more often, so having two is relevant. It doesn't just sit in your hand all game and be useless, kind of like Savage Roar can do when you're just playing the beatdown variant. But this is a weird hybrid between mid-range and tokens, and it's a very, very interesting hybrid between this, and I'd like to see Violet Teacher in more decks. I think Violet Teacher is a very, very underestimated card, and I think it should be run more, especially with things like Innervate. You just Innervate, make a token, play something else, make another token. Very, very good combo there. Now, on to type the third, we had Shark playing a Druid early mid-range deck. And the winner of the weirdest deck from the entire tournament goes to this thing. I don't know what I'm looking at. I'm going to be completely honest. This doesn't happen to me that often, because I've seen a lot of decks in my time. I've been playing Hearthstone for like 4 months before beta. So I've been playing Hearthstone for a long time. I don't know what I'm looking at right now. That's impressive. I commend you, Shark. But anyway, let's get started with this thing, shall we? So Defender of Argus, as I said before, is good against hunters and also buffs things up. Then we also have Sunfear Protector. So you'd think, wait a second, he's playing big stuff, or he's playing sort of like Shields Up engine. With Keeper of the Ghost, you'd expect it, but no, we have standard Druid of the Claw with Harvest Golem, Chillwind Yeti, Senjin. That's an old card from a previous metagame. We have a Senjin in here, and then Earthen Ring Farseer for the minions. It's one of the weirdest concoctions of minions I've ever seen. Not to mention, if you actually look at the curve, it stops at Druid of the Claw. The actual curve stops at 5, making this one of the most consistent draws as far as minions goes. Same with spells. The highest curve we have is Force of Nature, and you also have Innervate to lower the cost of some of these spells and minions, so the curve on this thing is incredibly low. It's one of the fastest mid-range decks I've ever seen. But as for the rest of the spells, it's pretty standard. We've got Force of Nature, Savage Roar with Wrath, Swipe, Innervate, and we have 6 cards here, which are weird. Starfall usually shows up as a one-off sometimes. This is a full 2 in this deck, because you need it to get over big things, and also helps with the aggro decks a little bit, and it's really, really nice to have the 2 copies of that in this kind of deck. Then we have 2 healing touches, which is one of the weirder things. So you have 22 points of healing in this deck. You're never dying to Hunter, basically. That's what the double healing touch is doing there. Double healing touch or double Earthen Ring, you are never losing to Hunter Rush if you play this deck. 22 points of healing, they don't stand a chance. Earthen Ring Farseer can also be used to heal up your own minions because you have the healing touches. You don't have to worry about your own life total. Very, very useful tech to have. And then lastly, we have a card which has not been played competitively in ages. I think we saw a one-off copy of it about a month ago. But this is 2 Mark of the Wild. Now, Mark of the Wild, not to be confused with Mark of Nature. Mark of Nature is terrible. Mark of the Wild is actually a very, very powerful buff. +2/+2 and Taunt is no joke. You put that on a Senjin, you end up with a 5/7 with Taunt. Chillwind Yeti, you end up with a 6/7 with Taunt, which is huge. You can put it on Druid of Claw with Charge, get a 6/6 Charge with Taunt. It's pretty incredible if you put this on some of the larger stuff. Even something like Harvest Golem becomes essentially a Chillwind Yeti with a Death Rattle and Taunt. It's a very, very interesting buff. I think one of the best buff targets in this deck probably be Harvest Golem, because you still get the token at the end, so putting 2 cards into one thing is not that bad, since the Harvest Golem usually trade 2 for 1 in the first place. But the reason this deck is so perplexing to me is the fact that Defender of Argus and Sunfury Protector are literally there to enable taunt for only Keeper, Earthen Ring, Harvest Golem, and Chillwind. I mean, if you think about it, Sen'jin and Druidal Claw already have taunt. Druidal Claw usually has taunt. It can be charged, but most of the time you play as a 4-6 because it's difficult to deal with. So it is very, very interesting to see that it's dedicated the full 4 taunts, just to the 4 full taunt givers, so to speak, just to give it to a grand total of 8 minions. But based on its performance, it obviously worked. That's the interesting thing about this. It obviously worked, and that's perplexing to me. And it's one of these rare occasions where normally when I look at a tournament, I won't go ahead and just go on Hearthstone straight away and build the deck to see if it works, because it might be a one-off or something like that. I wait a couple of weeks, and then if it comes up again, I'll build it. This is one of those decks which is so weird to me that I'm actually going to, right after recording this, go on Hearthstone while this is uploading and try and build this deck and see how it works. Because it's one of those decks I just haven't really seen before, or if I have, it didn't really make an impression on me. So I am very, very curious to see how this works. Especially 22 points of healing, that'd be interesting. Anyway, on to the last deck, another Priest. The Priests are invading. Anyway, from Tish we have a Priest midrange deck. Now, Priest midrange, a little bit more common. Not by much, but a little bit more common. Priests thin on the ground at the moment. But anyway, onto the actual minions. We have Karen Bloodhoof to hold down the mid game, along with Ragnaros to finish out later on, along with Ysera. Then we have Tinkmaster Overspark to deal with some of the really, really annoying threats, specifically things like Karen and Sylvanas and Ragnaros and Ysera and Alexstrasza and things like that, the big stuff. Then we have 2 Arcanized Soul Priests, which synergizes very, very well with some of the spells in this particular deck, and also just with your hero power. It literally turns it into just like a Shadow Presence, so you just deal 2 damage for 2 mana. Shadow form on a stick. It's pretty incredible. Then we have 1 Crazed Alchemist, which is a very, very interesting tech. Crazed Alchemist is one of those cards which is very underestimated, but I think has potential, especially if you're buffing up things' health. I mean, you do have the Power Word shields in this deck, so you can buff up your Arcanine, for example, and then flip it and deal a bunch of damage. But it also works on totems. You can flip a Flame Tongue totem to kill it, and it kills Nat Pagal. It's an interesting tech to add, and I think it might be one we see a little bit more of in the future. Then we have 1 of Defender of Argus. Defender of Argus is especially good in this deck because of Injured Blade Master. You can play Injured Blade Master and then heal it to get a Chillwind Yeti on turn 4 attacking. Or you can play Circle of Healing on it and get a 4/7 on turn 3. Now, a 4/7 on turn 3 is almost unstoppable. That is essentially a Twilight Drake coming out on turn 3. Or if you have Coin, turn 2. That can be healed by the hero power, which is incredible. Then we have Wild Pyromancer to synergize with all the cheap spells in the deck, and Earthen Ring Farseer to synergize really, really well with Injured Blade Master, and also to make sure that you yourself just don't die. Also works with Northshire Cleric, which is the draw engine in this deck. Then for the actual spells, we have 2 Holy Fire for burst damage and healing, Shadow Madness for those 2-for-1s, especially on Harvest Golem. Steal the Harvest Golem, run it into something else, you keep the token. Very, very, very valuable way of dealing with Harvest Golem. 2 Circle of Healing, synergize with Arcanine Soul Priest and Injured Blade Master. Then we have 2 Thought Steal, gives you information on your opponent's deck and also draws you cards. It draws you 2 cards. It's essentially an Arcane Intellect from your opponent's deck as opposed to yours. Then we have 2 Holy Novas as obligatory AoE, Mind Control to deal with some of the late game stuff. Shadow Word, again dealing with some late game stuff, less powerful than Mind Control, but far, far, far cheaper. 7 mana cheaper. That's why you have 2 Shadow Words and only 1 Mind Control. 1 Holy Smite is a concession to some of these aggro decks. And lastly, we have Power Word Shield to buff up things like Northshire Cleric and Injured Blade Master, making it into a 4/9. Even things like Ragnaros, so you just can't kill it, Cairn. There's lots and lots of good targets for this, and you can cantrip out of it, so it's just very, very powerful. Interesting thing is that you are playing the Holy Smite in this deck as opposed to the Shadow Word Pains, because Holy Smite is direct and also deals with a lot of other things to finish them off, as opposed to just dealing with a very, very select amount of minions. Anyway, this has been Jotto. Thank you all for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, put it in the comment section below. If you want to come chat to me at any point, I'll put the information to Managrind's Teamspeak in the description below. But as for now, this has been Jotto, signing off.